Hi, everybody. Welcome to the fourth in our series of the Leadership in Conversation with, the final one of the year. And we are joined today by the CEO of Ibec, Mr. Danny McCoy, and he'll be chatting with Mark Garrett. So I've asked you today if you have any questions to put them in the Q&A function, and we'll get into them throughout the programme. So I want to hand you over now to our Director General, Mark Garrett. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks everyone for joining, and welcome to, as Michelle said, the fourth in our leadership series that we've been having since September. You remember we had Minister Pascal Donoghue and leader of the Labour Party, Ivana Bacik, before the election started. During the election, we had a number of political journalists and commentators, Sarah Carey and Pat Lee, and we were joined by our policy director, Brian Hunt, on that occasion as well. So delighted today to welcome CEO of Ibec, Danny McCoy. Thanks, Danny, for joining us. Really appreciate it. There's plenty to talk about. You've been CEO of Ibec since 2009, and I think you've had a front row seat on a lot of, let's say, crises as well as successes for the Irish economy and Irish business and Ireland in that time.
It's starting.
The successes, are you taking credit for the successes and just not the challenges? Exactly. But maybe just resolve obviously some of the obvious questions that occur. We've just had an election and we don't yet have a new government. But I'm just wondering, from a business perspective and an economic perspective, what do you think the implications of this election will have on our economic future over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think, again, thank you very much for the invitation. And I think the immediacy has already been revealed. So, for instance, on the weekend of the election, we were lined up by international media like Bloomberg and so on for comment. And as the results came through, they weren't interested. All right? Yeah,
it was a boring
election from that point of view. So it's a continuity play, effectively. You know, as you say, we don't know exactly the makeup, but I think we're seeing continuity play, which is unusual enough at the moment. You know, it's been a year of elections. Every incumbent combination has lost both chairs. It's the first time that's ever happened since at least 1906, when they started taking the records. Happened here as well. Green Party obviously took the brunt. But it wasn't, you know, it wasn't, it was a surge towards the two incumbents. But still, continuity is the big thing. So that helps for business. Certainty is always good.
Well, like, I mean, in terms of, there's a lot of plans that people in the manifestos, as we know, the government will put together probably in the next number of weeks, maybe mid-January or so. Is that your expectation as well? And what are you expecting to see in that from a business and economic point of view?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the structural factors, everybody knows what we need to do, and we also have the money to do it. It's the effectiveness of delivery, unfortunately, is what's bedeviling us. So we have some good things in terms of the planning, law changes, and so on. So I think we've got the conditions right. It's just getting on and doing it. And one of the things that I find, particularly I'm leaning on today as well, a lot of economics, right, from my background, but you could distinguish between effectiveness, efficiency, and equity. And, you know, if you like to stylize it, the equity is, you know, trade union movement, the NGOs are always concerned about how things are fair. Business gets obsessed with efficiency, but everyone's assuming that the thing was done to start with. And, you know, the cake was made before we start fighting about how to share.
Sounds like a big assumption.
Yeah, and look, we see things like, not to keep banging on about the children's hospital, you know, I remember when Leo Varadkar was Minister for Health in 2015, he was talking about being paperless, but I remember pointing out it's currently childless. And it's now 9 years later and it's still childless, you know, so getting things done, get obsessed by the cost. I'm not dismissing inefficiency, but the first thing you got to do, like I can run 5-minute mile pace. I just can't run a mile at 5-minute mile pace, you know, so it sounds efficient, but I can't actually do it.
I'm not going to get into your running history on this particular call, but I mean, when you think about that in terms of infrastructure, we have, I mean, there's everything from housing, as you say, power now seems to be an issue, but the grid, the electricity grid, and I mean, the impacts we're seeing in terms of business. I mean, the legal profession right around the country is dependent on a healthy economy. We've seen over the last 25 years, effectively, the Law Society now has issued 12 housing practice certificates for the very first time. That's an increase of 100% since 2000. And if you map that curve against the economic curve of Ireland in that 25 years, they're very, very closely mapped. So the economy, businesses, households working well is everything to the legal profession as well. Do you see any dark clouds on the horizon from this election per se, but also then I think we have to move to Trump as well, what impact it had on this election, but also I think on Ireland's trading position as a small country trading internationally.
Yeah, listen, and that correlation, as you say, between the certificates for practicing solicitors, which you said 2000, right? I don't know for certain, but I would suspect in the last decade it's lagging behind what we need in terms of having enough solicitors.
Yeah.
Because we don't have enough of many things.
Mm.
And in about a 15-year period, the labour force and the employed, because we've got very little unemployment at the moment, is heading for 2.8 million people. And like when I started my economics career 35 years ago, there was 1.1 million in the workforce. So what we're seeing, particularly in the last 10 years, has been 400,000 extra people in the labour force and getting employed since COVID. Right? That's a dramatic. And so we just don't have enough of those very valuable services like legal services or health or care more generally. I define care not as just the minding of people, but the actual passing on of wisdom and advisory, etc.
Very wise, I might say. Think about it in that direction, but you're right. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The demand for legal services has massively increased, and we have talent, retention of talent, attraction of talent is a huge issue. But I think we're not unique when it comes to that. What you're saying here is that we have these pressure points right across the economy.
And in fact, if you think about it in the public realm, as you get richer as a society, and we have got rich really quickly, you want your public services personified. You want more teachers for the ratios to be lower with pupils in terms of medical, in terms of security, guards on the street, soldiers in the barracks, that kind of stuff.
You've made a big play of this over the last number of years. I mean, very unusually for a business organization, if you look across the world, and not many like you have been, which has been advocating for a bigger public sector, a bigger public service, a bigger government.
A pro rata one,
which is interesting. But explain that to me. I mean, why is it that you feel that that's necessary?
Well, so first of all, you can get efficiencies, right? So it's not that I'm denying efficiencies. And so, that big kind of clamor, legal services better, etc., etc. But the reality is, the point I was making, we want personification. If you think about regulation or planning, you have this scenario. I've actually, it's quite funny in its bizarreness. A company who hired a planner into their business because the planner was so good. And then there was no planner across the table from them for about 6 months because they hadn't backfilled that person's job. So it had all the logic of waking up at night in case you lose sleep. Right? So that kind of replicated in many ways. We don't have a pro rata scaled, and arguably, we want more public services pro rata as you get richer.
Yeah, well, there you go. Well, look, as I say, I think it's a really interesting and differential argument for a business organization to make. But basically, the foundation stone of successful businesses based on the services the state can provide.
Absolutely, and just like the legal services underpin the whole capitalist system. Exactly, crucial part.
Well, we'll certainly sing that song with you, and agree with that as well.
See, once bought, I stay bought.
Well, I'm glad to see it, and paying well, I'm sure, as well when it comes to those services. But I think just in terms of, I'll come back to Trump actually, because it is interesting in terms of maybe destabilizing what we see as success at the moment. And of course, nobody's denying the challenges that are there. But Trump coming in seems to change the game again, or does it? We've seen him before. But as a small nation, which is really dependent on multinational companies, largely American, not exclusively, but largely American, right around this country, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and the economic growth largely dependent on it as well.
That's true. So not to deny that, but the very first effect of the Trump election is there's been a real animal spirits unleashing in terms of investment. A lot of things were postponed on the run-up to that election have just been unleashed. Q4 is going to be a bit of a bumper one globally. And the momentum into 2005, lots of people are revising up their growth forecasts. The SRI did it today, Davies did it earlier on. And when we come to the Irish economy, the macro, in fact, at the moment, is in a really, really sweet spot. So Trump is going to, the Trump effect is certainly unleashing a lot of investment confidence. The question then is, does it get pulled to the United States or does it get dissipated around the world? And I would think it's probably the latter. But we're obviously uniquely dependent upon some idiosyncratic decisions. And if you think about it, it depends in the mix you're in. So, for instance, we know that chips production is going to be huge, but you could be unfortunate for the brand that you have, which is Intel at the moment, is struggling. So, what we find with Trump is that, in my view, on things like the corporation tax and the tariffs. They will not be as people are talking about now. These corporation tax won't go too far down because the US does actually have problems with their own debt. And putting the price down too much is taking away some very valuable corporate tax revenue that they'll want to get anyhow. So you have to be careful on that front. On tariffs, there's a kind of view in his rhetoric that it's going to be kind of a country of origin. Anything from Europe or anything from China will have, rate 25 or rate 60. That's not going to happen. Tariffs are very uniquely keyhole surgery. They really go after the pain point for the people you're putting pressure on. So, for instance, with your own background as well, Mark, remember Trump on the dairy, the Irish dairy. Part of that was because Still Hogan was the trade commissioner.
Yeah, and from Kilkenny, where Glanville was based,
exactly,
which is a huge dairy, international dairy company, which supplied lots of dairy.
And Europe did the exact same thing. So they targeted Mitch McConnell with from Kentucky with Bourbon, and Harley Davidson was Paul Ryan's backyard. And so we even see this at the moment where Europe and China are on tariff retaliations. Europe's put it on electric vehicles. China's chosen a product like pork to put a bit of sensitivity on that kind of Danish, northern Germany, and also Spain are big into it. They don't even go the whole pig. They might pick a bit of the pig, the trotters or the. So it can be very specific. It won't be this huge blanket.
Okay, so you're painting a picture of positivity, broadly about
the social
growth. We'll come back with that. I suppose we're focusing on the economics, that there's a potential here that the outlook will be more positive.
I think so.
We might have expected. But I was noticing you had an article in the Irish Times on Monday, which again Trump was mentioned, but in the context that really Ireland within the European context needs to get its own act together. And I think we've seen that with Draghi's report recently as well, that there's a greater concentration in Europe around what Europe can do as a bloc. And we're not even getting into what's happening in Ukraine clearly as well, but just from an economic point of view.
So again, in that article, I guess, I don't think I put it this way, but Trump at the moment is a known unknown, right? We know he's president. We're not sure what he's going to do from his own rhetoric.
Donald Rumsfeld will be just delighted with you, all the Republicans.
Exactly, but the known is definitely Europe. So we know right now that Germany and France are in serious, not just political trouble, but industrial, in terms of the heartland of the industrial base, particularly the car manufacturing industry in Germany. And there's open revolt between the business leaders and the political class developing in both France and Germany around the ESG agenda, for instance. So the United States have effectively, corporately as well, have reneged on the ESG agenda. Like in 2017, so the big leaders of companies in the United States, led by Jamie Dimon, signed this document, which also was a bit daft to start with. We're moving from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, as if the shareholder really just pari passu with the NGO or with the employees. That was never going to work. They've silently kind of reneged on that. And the world is rewarding them because lots of capital is moving to New York, and we've seen European companies, Irish companies move to the New York Stock Exchange in the last 3 years. And Europe is going to be plowing on in the ESG agenda, so to speak. And we've seen this corporate social responsibility directives, due diligence. This is coming under attack now in Europe. And I think Europe is going to split with the Draghi report to say that ESG, environmental, social governance issues, aren't going to be primary. They're going to go down in terms of order, and defence and security are going to go up to the top in Europe. And state aid rules, which would protect small countries like Ireland from big countries doing their purchasing power, we're going to see state aid rules set aside if you can justify something that's in the defence space. And that's going to put us at a very big disadvantage. Of course, I'm worried about Trump. I think we should worry about what's known. The dynamic in Europe.
So there's plenty of people who will be worried that you're talking about the ESG agenda being downplayed. I mean, the environmental crisis, climate change, and everything with that. People would say the feed crisis a lot of times. What you're saying is, for expediency at this point in time, would be set aside for, or at least downplayed for economic reasons.
Well, the German car industry, just to pick one, but it's more pervasive actually in Germany than just that single industry. They're basically saying we're going out of business here, and our competitors aren't being asked to do the same ESG.
And that's particularly China competition in terms of electric vehicles.
I think the States is very significant on there, and like even, not a lot of people talk about this, but even in the last year in our membership, we had a conference on the S in ESG, which was the name of the conference.
Yeah.
Even at that stage over a year ago, some American companies couldn't attend that because they wouldn't get sign off on anything that had ESG at the time.
Right.
It's, so in terms of investors on stateside, they don't want to hear about your ESG credentials. They want to know what's in it for the shareholder and how quickly can we get the money back out.
No, we've definitely seen that in terms of the conversations that are taking place in the political, but also the business development in the States over the last number of years that refocused on shareholder capital as opposed to stakeholder capitalism. And it'll be interesting to see how that then again with the American companies we have based here, how that might filter into Irish policy, with a perspective on that. Well, and now that we have the Greens, Irish government as well.
Yeah, I think you will see a bit of a rollback. I'm not saying we're going to go fully back.
Yeah.
Ireland has an opportunity maybe to stay the course because there's so much money in our system. We come back to that in a minute. And there might be a premium on actually holding your values a little bit higher. But we do need to be careful on the competitiveness agenda. The bit I think that Ireland won't roll back on is the S part, the social agenda.
Yeah.
And here's a perspective why I think that would be the case. It's not one that's very well articulated. But when I started off doing economics in the kind of this Pareto rule of the 80-20 kind of split, wages were 80% of the pie and profits 20%. And that's changed a little bit in other jurisdictions. Here, dramatically so. Here, if you stood back, there's 130 billion euros or so of wages and salaries in Ireland. So, divide your 2.7 or whatever, number, you get about 50,000 as your average wage, right?
Yeah.
So it's in that order of magnitude, 130 billion. When you look at the corporate tax revenue, just for an example, and the recurring one at the moment is about 30 billion. We have 40 because of the Apple one-offs, but it's about 30 billion at the moment. At, say, a 15% effective rate.
Yeah.
So what you're in there is 450 billion of net profits. Gross profits will be higher again because you can write off, right?
Yeah.
So you could be playing off 500 to 100. We're a very big profit. Now, in that context, you kind of got to keep your workforce sweet to keep all that going. And that's why the social agenda in terms of the layering on of right to disconnect, right to remote work, wages going up quite significantly, has a context. When it happens, though, you can see the SMEs go rightly angry and we have seen at the pile-on.
And look, there's a lot of legal businesses that are small businesses right around the country who are feeling that cost pressure. And I think it's interesting, one of the other maybe unusual positions you've taken in recent times is saying, in terms of pushing back against the idea of a cost of living crisis in Ireland. I think it's the crisis bit. It's not an issue around that clearly the cost of living is going up, but is it a crisis as Europe?
My point's a crisis. So in order to get attention, I didn't even get enough attention as it happens because there was.
Sorry about that. We're giving you attention.
We're giving you attention on the edge of being cancelled, right? But so just at the start of the election, I had said this in conversation with Simon Harris and Micheál Martin as well, that I just thought their line, because they were pushing this, they were addressing the cost of living crisis. My point is there isn't one, right? The crisis. And so how can you have a crisis? The prices have gone up, but if incomes have gone up in step or higher, how is that a crisis? And to believe it is and act upon it is potentially to create other crises. If I can give you a moment just to explain. So on the income side, the income tax returns, the employers know exactly what they're paying out in terms of their wage bill, in terms of the kind of 4 or 5% wage growth that's been in the economy for some time now. And then just by the government's own hand, in terms of the welfare payments, the minimum wage going up so the minimum wage going up by 20% in 2 years when inflation has been cumulatively 3%. So, crisis, what crisis. And also in terms of the welfare payments, I think it's really important, not that I begrudge old age pensioners getting their double weeks and 2 double weeks, it would be more interesting to call it as it is. That's a 2% increase for every 1 week you get in a 52-week year. So 2 of those is 4%, and the rate went up by 4%. There's an 8% increase to the welfare recipient against consumer price inflation of about 1% at the moment. And this has been the crisis. Now, why this is a problem is actually another piece of information that we got over the summer, which is European Central Bank did a survey of the 20 countries or so that are using the euro and said, what's the inflation rate to the people on the street? Ireland was the second worst. Greece was the worst, and I give them a pass because I don't believe any statistical agency, right? Because of history. But we were really bad in this one because when it was 2%, our best guess on average was 5%. Now, if you think about it from the other side of the equation here, the business side, if you're receiving 2% increase for your prices, but your workers are thinking it's 5%, and they're looking for 5% wages, that gap is your productivity competitiveness loss. And there's nothing other than ignorance causing that. Because if we can both agree on the facts, there are other factors of competitiveness that we have to deal with.
Well, we're certainly getting into a big political and philosophical issue there, because I mean that seemed to be the argument of the Democrats and Biden administration in the US for quite a while, that ultimately the economy was doing fairly well, but people were not feeling that. Now, I'm not trying to equate the Irish economy with the US. We're in a very different place, but there's quite clearly that people felt a cost of living crisis as it maybe became termed. But is there, it brings us to a bigger point, there isn't much room in the public political discourse at the moment for that sort of thinking. And intellectual thinking based on facts doesn't seem to get the rigor or probably get the traction it used to get. Is that my misperception?
Well, it's easy for me to say this because I'm not in the political sphere, right? But there's a real logic of, they're my followers, I must follow them logic going on, rather than I should be leading here.
That's what the slides bit is also.
And you're supposed to lead your followers. But there's a bit of the followers telling me this, so I follow them. Even though you're in charge. Can I give you this fact, right? So this goes with the average, right? And everyone goes nuts about the average. So I know people this way, that way. We've got, give or take, 2 million households. That's a large sample, right? Last night in the Irish banking system, we know this for a fact, there was about 160 billion euros on deposit in the Irish banking system last night, owned by Irish households. That works out about 80,000 euros on average per household. The politicians went to the general election, and every day they were picking up a really good sample because they were shaking hands with thousands of people. So any photograph you see, in all likelihood, Simon Harris and Micheál Martin and Ivana Maciek, when you see that photo, we're shaking hands with somebody who lives in a house that has 80,000 on deposit in the banking system. Put that in context for the narrative that we've been living through.
And look, I mean, I did see that report, and it's really interesting. The two elements to it. One was that various other statistics out there at the moment, house prices being potentially 10% overvalued, but also as a savings rate, which has come out in the last while, which is at a very high level. Sure, clearly not everybody can be at that level. On average, I appreciate the difficulty with average. But if you look at 10% overpriced, the sort of warning bells here and there that we're hearing, are not going to be too alarmist about it, but there are similar wordage that we heard, 2006, 2007, 2008. Do you think we're heading in that direction again at any point in the near future?
At any point would be probably where I'd have to agree with it, but not at the moment, because there is a fundamental difference between the last time. This is classic. It's different this time, and it goes and happens again. Is the last time we're definitely credit fueled, right? And the solution to the overvaluation is solved by more houses. Supply and demand. It's the lack of supply is a real pinch point for those prices at the moment. And so I think just on that line about the Irish households, it's a very serious point. Like, if you think about that 160 billion, it's passive. It's not earning any interest of any significance. It's not being utilised to do the things that we need, which could be to recycle it back into producing more houses, and that would require people being displaced from other activities into building. So be it. But I think what a lot of people don't realise is how wealthy the households are in Ireland, and that the government's main competitor is the private sector. But corporates building stuff. You think the children's hospital, right? I know people are tired of the children's hospital, so am I. But it's not Ireland crushed. you know, people think it's Ireland Crusher. There's nothing happening in Ireland when you're building Ireland Crusher, right? There's nobody competing against you. Like Intel, we just mentioned earlier on, they put 17 billion up the road in the same 4 years that Children's Hospital has been running over budget. Or if you look down the quays and you see all the cranes in commercial real estate, it's very hard for the state to actually transact. Even at the level of the household, if somebody hired a nanny, that nanny could have been in the Montessori school down the road, looking after 5 children, might only be looking after 2. The private sector keeps outbidding the government in a way that the narrative in the media is not there. I still think the government's all powerful here. And they have a lot of money, but their failure to transact, it's not going to be helped by giving the households more and more money to outbid them for providing the public services.
Well, working on the basis of maybe getting down to the narrow sense of household, maybe we'll get a bit parochial about the law. It's really interesting. I'm sure solicitors around the country will be interested to hear what is the expectations of business, of lawyers, the legal system at this point in time. We talked about infrastructure earlier and the infrastructure of the law, which is, you know, very healthy in many places, but frayed at the edges in many communities around the country as well. So.
Yeah, so listen, as a community of professionals, you'd be tired of hearing the cost mantra out there. You know, that's with none of the benefits ever described of how a functioning legal system and transactional system, you know. So
I'm glad you've taken my talking points. That's exactly right.
Thank you. Yeah, cash on delivery. And but no, just in terms of it's often misunderstood by capitalists or those who profess to be capitalist, how much is underpinned by the legal system. You know, so in terms of property rights, you know, universality, if everything was owned, is very helpful. When everything is not owned, like the tragedy of the commons of environmental, whenever market failures come and you don't have universality of property rights. But then the more kind of more mundane things in terms of exclusivity of your property right, the enforceability of it, and fundamentally the transferability of it to the market transaction, all are underpinned by the legal system. Any deficiencies in that, capitalist system starts to fold. And we've seen this depends on goodwill. And we're seeing so much bad will in the world right now, people just appropriate assets. So, you know, and that's really important to have an underpinned society by a good legal system. And then at the level of the SME firm or at the household, having access to your local solicitor to do those life events and to make sure the transferability, exclusivity, and so on.
Yeah, look, I think that is fundamental point around like to having a healthy society, healthy economy, healthy businesses, healthy households. I mean, you have to have that ability to be able to access your rights. Usually not in the good times. It's usually unfortunately when things are not going as well as they should. But the interesting one, I mean, I know I mentioned this to you before. I mean, we're finding a disproportionate activity. I mean, clearly very much based on the economy. We have 550 trainees coming to the law school here last September for the full-time PPC course, but 92% of them are contracted to Dublin firms, despite the fact that they come from every county in the country. We now have 15 counties with 0 trainees in that intake, and we're doing certain amounts of it. But I'd say this is not a story that's unusual to you. I mean, you hear that the GPs and vets and other professional services right around the country. And I mean, part of our
vets are doing well, actually. You know, as a parent and dog owners, it's easier for our dogs to get seen quickly and get medicine quickly.
And actually, you laugh at my point because this is the point: the big animal practices in rural areas are really struggling. But exactly, I'm afraid the dogs and the cats are being extremely well looked after, and the vets are they're basically coming to those small practices in urban areas that are looking after pets.
Yeah, so you get these displacements, but they're really bad, and that gives a sense of rural Ireland, urban Ireland tensions. And I think it's something that the state, you know, is not really identifying, not going to possibly do much about other than market forces. And I think that element of, like, the first thing to say, surprise everybody, rural Ireland is richer than urban Ireland, right? Facts prove this, right?
I am intrigued.
Not a lot of people know that.
Right? Say this is a goal.
So is that very often the mistake of the bubble of Dublin is when you hear the word rural, you think farming. Very few people actually do farming in Ireland. Most rural employees are involved in professional services, manufacturing is very big in the Western Seaboard. So while people might go to the urban area to do the activity when they go back home, and back into a kind of might be deemed a rural setting. And if you look across rural Ireland is, as I said, because I think people think when they think urban, I think Dublin, they think Ballsbridge.
Yeah.
Right. So don't factor in the rest of Dublin, which will have various levels of income. And so there isn't that huge level of disparity. I mean, Dublin is richer and so on, but in terms of quality of life, it's another issue in terms of cost and what you can do on incomes in rural Ireland. It's different. So I think there's a narrative in rural Ireland that the expectation is that people have good jobs, have good incomes, and they want good services. And they're probably more devoid not having a solicitor in the town or having a GP. It's pretty more shocking.
Yeah.
Dublin's bad enough, but you kind of think you might be able to get it somewhere.
Like we're finding we're investing resources into trying to support those small practices in a number of ways, and I'm sure they would say we're not doing enough, and I appreciate that we need to do more. But we're also looking at government and the idea that this is a societal issue, that businesses will not find it, be able to find those services, but also obviously their employees that they're looking to employ. And we feel that there's a need for a more societal. Do you feel there's going to be much traction for that at a government level or business level?
I think there should be. I think it's a really big issue, and I certainly suffer from Connacht, God help us. But
some with more All Ireland, some with more All Ireland than others. Before you get the dig in.
Yeah. Well, I was telling you earlier about that statistically that a female actually born in Hall Street now has more than a 60% chance of reaching the age of 100 and still won't see me win the All Ireland.
Thanks for that. Has to be done.
But in that kind of rural distribution of population, I think that's something that really needs to be addressed. So the balanced regional development used to be about industry. The irony of it is industry is well distributed now. What's not distributed is the social cohesion piece of the services that were relied on before that made the quality of life worth having. And so when you start having a GP, a solicitor, the shop, a lot of Irish towns and villages, to an anthropologist looks like devastation. Everything is boarded up. You kind of got the poor creatures that live in this place must be awful. If you come like 400 meters from the centre, the small area population shows this. You're going to see the Dermot Bannon inspired house with the extension and the big car outside. People just don't go into the village, they go to the nearest Aldi or Lidl in the kind of bigger town. The way we're living is very different. And the political classes don't appear to be picking this up. It hides in plain sight, Ireland. And the narrative never.
I don't think success is something that we like to wear heavily, shall we say, as our circumstance. But that's an interesting take, which is not normally heard in the public discourse at the moment. And maybe just to take that broader perspective again, right, about you seem to be quite optimistic about where we currently are, but also about the future. I mean, if you're looking 5 years, 10 years down the line, how do you see the Irish economy, Irish society, given all those, suppose, the dark clouds on the horizon? We have so much.
I am actually pessimistic about one thing. So I'm going to be blasé about Trump and all of the geopolitical bad actors that are out there and the dangers out there. I do feel that we need to mind our own narrative in the sense that we're getting complacent. There's so much money, it's kind of easy times. We could lose sight of the underpinning of our success, which is goodwill and stability and all the things that we champion and will continue, I think, for a few more years. So I'm not calling that. Where there is an erosion on goodwill towards Ireland. And that goodwill.
So when you mean goodwill, you don't mean within Ireland, you mean towards Ireland.
Towards Ireland, And these are very sensitive issues, right? And so humanitarian grounds and doing the right thing in terms of Gaza and Palestine, that has quite big political issues for our business model. And the reality of the world is where the funders come from, and New York's finance and so on. But also our positioning is, could be seen as a bit like when you pass around the sponsorship card. The first person rushes in and puts €100 and kind of bounces the rest and puts into being a bit more magnanimous. That's fine, but it's really not fine if you found out that the first person who did it never actually paid. Right, you get doubly angry. Now, we say things about what we're going to do internationally, but we're not putting any money behind it. Like, for instance, the Apple tax money.
Yeah.
We said we didn't want it. Clearly, there's an argument made we didn't need it. We looked at the scales of what we already had. We didn't put that money to use anywhere else in the world, even though we're professing to have high moral ground on stuff that a lot of people are watching us. And a lot of people think we're hypocrites. And goodwill goes away at that.
I have not heard anyone else make an argument around the Apple tax money. That's not something that's made. I mean, that's really interesting.
Nobody listens to me more. I actually said this in RTE and News Talk.
Yeah, maybe this is the new media.
And the say Ibec fumbles in the greasy tail.
There you go. There you go. Look, so normally I ask people, like, because they can be pessimistic. I'm usually asking them where they need to see optimism in the future. But obviously, Ireland's goodwill internationally. Is there any particular? Are you feeling this pressure from America, from Europe, or do you feel it's more international than that?
I think actually this I hope my narrative's not right. I also think we should address it or think about it at least. You know?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we reverse out of positions. I just think you back up and are willing to pay for your values, rather than showboat.
Yeah.
And not put the values back in. I think our pressure will come from within Europe. The United States tends to be much more transactional, and some costs are sunk and maybe annoyed at you for a while, but the deal's a deal, get over it. I think in Europe we probably have more pressure points because we're not contributing to the European common defence. Our neutrality is really an issue. And it's not beyond the bounds to think that in the next 5 years, one of the criteria that we put into investment decisions will be the following. Can that country secure our assets? Are they part of a bloc like NATO? And if they're neutral, can they defend their neutrality? Do they have a defense system that's capable of defending it? And if you can do the ticks on that, then you might see some investment can come there. Because you think about the ESG on the investment, have you an environmental plan, or are you looking after the supply chain? Well, what if defense starts to become more significant? How confident are we can raise that challenge?
Well, that's really interesting. Do you think that the recent joining of Finland and Sweden to NATO has changed the dynamic across Europe? Because they're traditional countries we would have looked to as non-aligned in our military perspective, but that's completely changed now.
I think so. As I said, I was in Warsaw. I'm not sure I said it earlier, but I was in Warsaw quite recently. And like our friends in the Baltic countries are actually, they're not just concerned, like they are petrified of Russia right now.
And these are countries who offered huge support to Ireland during the Brexit crisis, whereby the idea that a small European country would be under pressure. In solidarity, they were coming to our aid in those circumstances.
So we look like free riders. But worse than that, free riders with a lot of posturing.
Okay, well, that's certainly a more negative perspective that I've heard from yourself and others as well. I might just go to the Q&A, and please, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat. And we have one here from Fiona about technology and obviously its ability to disrupt industry in Ireland. So she's asking, how do you think Ireland is prepared, and do we regulate ourselves out of opportunities as well?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a common European disease at the moment, first to regulate, last to innovate. And I think that really is an issue for Ireland. You see that in the AI space in particular, on these, I'm not in my depth in terms of technology, but just what I'm picking up into, in terms of these large language models and so on, that increasingly, if we're not allowed access to European data and preferences and so on, the answers you will get will be Californian answers, and they may be socially different in attitudes to that. So in not allowing us to be able to innovate and use that, that's just kind of one small thing. But there's other technologies might be the right description, but breakthroughs like Ozempic, right? We're seeing a lot of kind of change from lifestyle issues, and even for convenience stores, they're already noticing the Ozempic effect in the States and in Europe, because that last 100 meters you have to go to a petrol station to get to the till, the amount of chocolate bars. There would obviously be a correlation between those who are eating them and going on the Ozempic, and you see a lot of shift pattern. And that goes to the heart of something. So I'm moving slightly away from technology, but it's kind of societal changes as well, which the Restaurants Association, having a lot of difficulty at the moment. But when you look at the consumer survey, they'll say the adage, because they repeat back since like us, I'm really worried about cost of living prices. But then they say, well, your savings wouldn't go up in a cost of living crisis. You try to run down your savings to keep your standard of living up if you're triggering the crisis. So we're seeing our savings going up. And so the question they're asked, why is your savings going up? And they give 4 reasons. One, they say, I'm very environmentally friendly now. I kind of believe it, don't believe it, right? You might profess it, but your actions might be a bit different.
The Greens of last election might profess otherwise.
The second one is that kind of lifestyle, health, well-being. I'm doing different consumption patterns. I'm not consuming as much, maybe in the restaurants also. Then the next one is, I want experiences. I'd rather pay 5 times for one night out, possibly in Portugal, but for one night out than 5 times. And then the first one is kind of connected as well, which is they're satiated. How many more flat screen TVs do you want me to buy this year? And that actual satiation point is really being felt in the fashion industry right now, in Primark and so on. And so if you're watching the sales patterns, there's a sense of kind of having enough of stuff. And what you really need, though, is go back to our social issues. What we really need is to have our kids be able to be reminded and seen by GPs. And so, going back to the very first question, maybe our general election hasn't actually sorted that out at all. Maybe the continuity is we're just going to continue to get the same thing in the next 5 years. You want something real now, here, have some money.
Well, there certainly seems to be a lot of money being thrown around in the election.
Yeah.
And maybe, look, we might just close it out a little bit, coming back to that election and that piece. And, there's a lot of speculation around how the government might be formed. And obviously, I think most people now believe, obviously, that Fianna Fáil and Gael together with their 86 votes will be there with a small number of others. But more importantly, I suppose, who gets what job, of course, is always a speculation. Any best guesses on who might be Minister for Finance, Minister for Justice, might be of interest to us here on the side as well? Any insight into those?
Wow, I really don't, but why not? You ask me the question, I'm foolish enough to give answers.
Don't worry, this is being recorded.
Yeah, no, I didn't. Well, actually, one time I was asked by the currency, what job would I like in cabinet? They thought I'd want finance. I probably would, but the one I wanted was Simon Harris at the time, the educational one. And the morning it landed, he was in Ibec, and so I was sitting there, as if I was covetous of his job. I was only answering a question, and I really wanted to get in again. Presuming Micheál Martin is Taoiseach, to start with.
Good presumption.
Okay, I think Simon Harris would probably go into enterprise.
Okay.
Which is unusual, but we never had Taoiseach that went back before Leo Varadkar went back from being Taoiseach into a cabinet. Correct me on that one. And so that might be a new pattern where you kind of hang out so you get ready to go back in again. Because foreign affairs, as we know, is kind of dangerous. I know Micheál Martin did it that way. It can be dangerous. And depends on your kind of age profile as well, I suppose, a little bit. So I'm speculating here. Simon Harris to go into enterprise. Peter Burke will be really annoyed at me now for saying that, but I'm sorry about that, Peter. And I think Fianna Fáil might take justice. Just to answer your kind of question. And finance might go back to Fine Gael. Finance could be in a tug of war. There's something to be said for bringing deeper finance back together. Particularly if they want this ministry for infrastructure.
So they have to swap that around in that context. No, I must admit, I was always a big believer in separation. That's a personal view. I mean, on the basis that we have all of this power in finance, when you've got the expenditure and the taxation side of it, and even I think we saw during the economic crisis in particular, it outweighed the weight of the Taoiseach's role in government. So I think that's a huge challenge.
You'd be better placed.
It's an interesting balance. It's an interesting balance thing, but I think
dissipation of power dynamics.
There's a bit of that. But look, I think there's, and also the scenario with a coalition, you probably want to divide and conquer here as well. We have a couple more questions here, and thank you, Anonymous, who's come back with a question about if you wanted to see one really radical policy proposal in a new government, what would it be?
I see just in the interest of time, I also see the digital currencies, blockchain, in there as well. On the radical policy proposals, just be consistent. I think we really need to build our goodwill. And I think that whole issue about our defence and security requires a very significant uplift. To give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about here, our defence budget at the moment is about 1.3 billion. Our GDP is about 500 billion, so it's about 0.5 or something like that. If we were to go to the 2%, which is now a minimum, and our Estonian friends and so on would rather the world go to 3%, as would Trump, that's 10 to 15 billion a year recurring. So if I was radical, that's where I'd be putting my money. I sound like a hawk here, obviously.
Those cables.
My cuddly social.
You're bouncing it out, I think.
Agenda. And then there's the blockchain and cryptocurrencies. These really are disruptors. You know, financial services are quite disruptive at the moment in terms of a lot of flux. And very quickly on this is that we've been around this mulberry bush before with money, and very quickly is how paper money came about is you used to leave your gold, the goldsmiths, and if you put it in two goldsmiths, A and B, but you knew A was absolutely safe and B safe-ish, when you were on the street, you're more likely to give the B one piece of paper than the A one. And that's referred to as Gresham's law in economics, is that bad money chases out good money. That's why governments came and became sovereign and basically said, you can't have money, we're the money, the central banks. Got to be careful when you don't understand blockchain or cryptocurrencies, you're likely to end up with paper B than paper A. And I think this could be a big issue. I think you could see quite a lot of crashes here. Then it'll end up getting regulated. It have to be completely regulated again, just like we did in the past.
Well, why don't we just end it there on the basis of when you're talking about more regulation, you're talking about more lawyers. That's possibly a most positive aspect of the correction from their point of view. And look, I just want to thank Danny for taking the time and thank you for joining us. This has obviously been the fourth of our series, and please look out for more in 2025.
Exactly. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Danny. Just to say thank you, everybody, for engaging with the programme so far this year. It's been really wonderful, and we hope to come back in the new year with some more. So send some ideas of who you'd like to see in the hot seat opposite Mark. Thank you very much, and for all your questions today, very much appreciated. Happy Christmas. Thank you.